Hello and welcome to Florida Politics Now. I'm Cody Butler with Summer Smith at WWSB, David Snyder at WCJB, Jessica Foster at WJHG, and Jacob Murphy at WCTV. We're talking all things Florida politics this week, and as expected, it did not take long for the first lawsuit to be filed in the new congressional map. The governor signed that on Monday, and within an hour, there was a lawsuit filed here in Leon County.
Hour of Governor Ron DeSantis signing Florida's new congressional districts into law, voting advocates challenge them in court.
We see it for what it is. It's rigging the map and stacking the deck to give one party an advantage over the other.
Equal Ground rallied against the maps at the Capitol last week. It was the first group to sue the state over the new map Monday, arguing it violates Florida's Fair Districts Amendment, which bans drawing maps for political gain.
While this conversation is happening nationally, Florida is an outlier because we have already expressly and clearly called for partisan gerrymandering to not be a part of the way that we draw our maps.
DeSantis' office told lawmakers last week race wasn't used to draw Florida's new map. Instead, political data was.
I'm not exactly sure when Ron DeSantis and his administration became the judge, jury of what is the Florida Constitution and decide which parts of our Florida Constitution he can uphold and which ones he doesn't have to.
State lawmakers quickly passed new congressional boundaries in last week's special session, despite polling that showed it's widely unpopular among voters. Florida Democratic Party Chair Nikki Fried says the new map might look more red on paper, but it could backfire.
They watered down their own districts. So what used to be maybe an R plus 34, 36 is now an R plus 11, R plus 12.
Republicans brushed off concerns last week.
This map is based on a strong and viable interpretation of both the Florida and the United States Constitution.
Show the bill passes.
Florida became the first state to pass new maps hours after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled states can't rely too heavily on race when drawing districts. Political analyst Susan McManus says voters have more questions than answers now, which could hurt turnout in November.
This is the most unusual situation that I think Florida voters have ever found themselves in, where all of a sudden it's just what they thought was going to be this is now that, and we don't know whether the courts are going to step in and change it in time.
Alabama and Tennessee are having special sessions to redraw their congressional maps after last week's Supreme Court ruling. In Tallahassee, I'm Cody Butler reporting.
And more lawsuits have been filed. There are several voting groups that have filed suit in 3 different lawsuits. As they go through the process, those are expected to be combined into one because they're all pretty much arguing the same thing.
And Cody, we talked about this before, that the fact that the late date of this actually happening actually really makes it very difficult to challenge in court, doesn't it? Because there's a time compression between now and when state election supervisors have to have their ballots ready.
Yeah, and this is going to be a long, drawn-out process, likely. We saw this with the last redistrict challenge in 22. The lawsuits were filed to try to stop that map from being in play before the election. That wasn't decided till last year, so that took about 3 years to play out. So these maps, the map that we currently have that passed and signed into law, will likely be the map that we have in November, just based on how fast things are moving. The judge that was assigned to the case, the state asked to remove, and the judge accepted because he was the first one that threw out the first map. And then the appeals process kind of tossed out his original ruling. So he's recused himself at the request of the state on that already. So this is already being drug out as we just get started.
And Cody, some of the districts weren't touched. I know District 2 remained intact the way that it was before. Has there been any discussion on why certain districts weren't touched?
Yeah, about 80% of the map was changed in some form. District 1, District 2 weren't changed. Basically, geography kind of played a role in that. What they did was they kind of made kind of a hub and spoke out of like the Tampa area, Fort Lauderdale, and Orlando area made some of those, split some of those cities. The argument was population growth was one of the arguments that the governor was throwing around, trying to make sure that you have the districts reflect where people have been moving to. But they also said that they just looked at party data when they were drawing the map. So those districts were also more Democratic when they were in the previous map. So that's kind of where they were kind of shifting it. And then just some other, when they were kind of shifting the maps down further in the peninsula, some of the adjustments were made up north to just make sure that everything was populated equally or close to equally as much as possible. So that's kind of where they were drawing the map the most, was down the peninsula, particularly down in South Florida.
It's very interesting because District 2 is such a large district when you look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and keep in mind, they're also looking at population. The districts have to have about the same number of people. So the Panhandle doesn't have nearly as many people as the peninsula. The larger cities are down the peninsula. So that's kind of why we have the large geographical area in the north and the tighter compressed districts down in South Florida and more in the more urban areas.
And Cody, it's remarkable the quickness. It seems every day we have a new major national headline about different states redistricting. I know the Virginia Supreme Court ruling today has captured a lot of attention and dealt a big blow to Democrats for nationwide. And to what I can tell, the vote from Virginia was just a few weeks ago, and then the Supreme Court there in that state was able to issue a ruling quite quickly. But here in Florida, it sounds like there's no way it's going to be that quick of a decision, especially by the state's highest court. And of course, we would expect the Supreme Court here in Florida to probably rule in favor of the governor's map. But can you speak to just the difference in timelines and just how all of the states playing together kind of is a factor here?
Yeah, this has been a national push across the country. Tennessee's was in a special session this week, redistricting that was passed and signed into law yesterday on Thursday. And so the Virginia ruling Friday was kind of sped up theirs. I believe that lawsuit was filed directly with the Supreme Court and they took it up. And so Florida would basically require it to start at the local level and then work its way through the appeals process before getting to the Supreme Court, which is what we saw a few years ago when District 2 was the one that was challenged with the previous map that was passed.
Cody, I found it remarkable that Nikki Fried would admit that even if they are Republicans are diluting congressional districts, they would still have double-digit advantages in many of these places. So to play the devil's advocate here, does it really matter if they redistrict? Nikki Fried was kind of pointing to that these are now more competitive districts. The Democrats have been overperforming in special elections and off-year elections over the last few years. We've seen where Trump lives in Mar-a-Lago, that House seat in the Florida legislature flipped to a Democrat this year. So that's kind of where she's seeing the momentum, and she's expecting to hang on to the seats that they currently have and pick up some of these more competitive seats in some of these districts that they had to basically dilute to kind of break up some of the Democratic districts. So Nikki's optimistic that they'll be able to pick it up along with Trump's approval rating declining, and the approval rating in Congress is also down. So she's hoping all those kind of external factors will help with the blue wave in some of those districts and more competitive districts that are now into law.
And while many are celebrating the changes, we see many are not, obviously. Is there a concern that this will lead to voter frustration and a lack of people showing up at the polls because of all this happening?
Yeah, it's a major concern, especially some of these people that they've known who their person in Congress has been for several years. Now, all of a sudden, it's going to be someone different. And I believe it was Tampa was split up into 4 different ways where it used to all be in one district. And so St. Petersburg is a perfect example of that one. That one was divided into 4 districts downtown St. Petersburg. And so your neighbor might have one person in Congress and you might have someone else. So it could lead to voter frustration, voter confusion. And the concern is these people are just going to stay home because they don't know what's going on, because this is a time where we would normally be redistricting without a court order. And so that's kind of where a major concern is right now. But we'll wait and see exactly how things play out. Really, the people running for Congress and a lot of these districts will now have their work cut out for them to make sure that they're campaigning and voters know kind of what's going on. All right, and when we come back, we're taking a look at another lawsuit. This one deals with education funding here in the state of Florida. Welcome back to Florida Politics Now, where the state's been slapped with quite a few lawsuits this week, including one from the largest teachers union in the state, claiming that the state is violating its constitutional obligation when it comes to funding public schools in the state.
Educators, parents, and students from across the state gathered here at the Capitol to urge lawmakers to put more money into the state's public schools.
The fact that Florida really has failed to meet the constitutional requirement of this state.
Florida Education Association President Andrew Spar claims the state failed to ensure a high-quality, uniform system of public education as required by the state constitution. He says suing the state is a last resort to make sure Florida classrooms get the money they need.
You hear about positions being eliminated, programs being cut, employees being laid off, students being in larger and larger classes.
Spar points to several areas, including the money in the Universal School Choice program with different transparency requirements. He says Florida is ranked 41st on per-student funding and last in average teacher pay, forcing many to leave.
It's a disruption in learning, and that's way too common in the state of Florida. Too many students, hundreds of thousands of students, are impacted by this constant churn and by the teacher and staff shortages we see in the state of Florida.
State leaders disagree with these claims, pointing to money state lawmakers set aside specifically for teacher raises and increasing the per-student base, which are expected to stay in the upcoming state budget. Senate K-12 Education Committee Chair Corey Simon says the problem comes down to how districts are using various state funds.
You had districts that went out and they picked up recurring costs on non-recurring dollars. And so now they want to come to the state for budgets that have gotten out of whack instead of putting those dollars in the hands of the teachers.
Chief Financial Officer Blazin Golia says he's going to start auditing school districts across the state. He claims they have the money now if they make the right cuts.
there is more than enough room for them to cut the administrative costs, deliver a world-class education, and still give teachers raises.
Meanwhile, SPAR has one message for lawmakers as they finalize the state budget.
We have to invest in Florida's future. We have to invest in our students.
Lawmakers will be back in Tallahassee starting next week to pass the state budget. That's expected to go for the next 3 weeks. In Tallahassee, I'm Cody Butler reporting.
And when lawmakers do come back to pass that budget, they're going to be starting where they left off, and both chambers will be passing the same budget that they passed during regular session when they couldn't figure out where to agree.
Cody, is there any indication that they're going to make any changes to the school choice program? I know that public school advocates have been concerned that it's taking money away from public schools, but those who utilize the school choice and those scholarships, the Step Up for Students, they're in favor of keeping it intact. Have you heard anything about any of that?
Yeah, the Auditor General had audited this program and found that there were systematic failures in how this is being executed across the state, and had some recommendations. And the Senate tried to, the Senate did pass a bill, one of their first bills during regular session, that would fix some of that, and that includes separating the money for public schools and the school choice scholarship program, because right now it's all lumped together. And so this bill would have separated that. The House didn't take it up, but there's some hope that this might be played out in the budget process, and that those line items would be separated as they work on the budget over the next few weeks. So there still could be some fixes on that, but that's one of the areas that the Senate at least had tried during regular session to kind of put into statute. But they could still do the same thing with the budget process. It's just not going to be spelled out to do that every year.
With a growing number of parents taking their kids out of public schools and putting them into charter schools, private schools, et cetera, is there any sense among the education leaders in the state, or with even the teachers union, that perhaps the model needs to change when it comes to public education?
That's kind of the argument that the state is taking on this, is that with the universal school choice now here in Florida, that these schools are seeing declining enrollment, so why put more money into them? But Senator Simon was pointing out, because COVID had an influx of money everywhere, and so these school districts, he says, were putting kind of salaries and things like that on these one-time funds during COVID, instead of kind of where they might have, like improving a building or something like that, that might only need a one-time payment instead of these reoccurring. So they're looking at several options and just kind of figuring out kind of where things need to go.
That was interesting, the mentioning of an audit of all the school districts. In my opinion, it's greatly needed. And it's interesting to hear state leaders saying that. Is there concern, obviously, that funding is being misused? It was mentioned with the administration. It sounds like state leaders are saying, look, this is an individual school district problem, not a statewide problem.
The CFO Angolia has said that he wants to audit these school districts, kind of like he's going and auditing cities and counties, seeing where there's waste, fraud, and abuse. And he is already pointing out to administrative levels that could be cut. I believe I saw it was Lee County. They have a new superintendent. They're making cuts at the district office instead of in the classroom to kind of fix some budget issues that they're having. So this is something that I know the CFO is greatly interested in. I think he wants to, if he's reelected in November, he wants to look at every government entity that he has authority to look at while he's in office. So we can expect to see more of those Doge-like audits happening across the state, and potentially finding money that school districts could be directing to the classrooms to address on these issues. And the governor pointed out, I believe it was last week, that these many of these teachers say that they're not seeing their influx in pay that the state has been setting aside specifically for teacher pay. So he's been blaming the unions on that, saying that's been a negotiating tool that the unions have been using to address some other issues. That was why he cited some of his anti-union bills here recently. So it's going to kind of come down to see how these districts are spending their money and seeing where they end up that money actually ends up going.
So, Cody, a lot of finger pointing, but the fact remains Florida remains last in the nation in average teacher salary, and that's been a stat for a while. And I assume other states have those similar issues with potential misuse at the district level and potential union tactics. Is there any response from the state about when they are told they're averaging at the bottom for a teacher salary?
The state points to their influx that they've passed over the last few years, specifically for teacher pay. I think last year it was $1.3 billion that they set aside specifically for teacher pay. The unions argue that that's still not enough, that they've been underfunded for so long that it's going to take a lot more money to catch up with some of these other states. We see teachers leaving the state for other states that they're paid more. And so it's a constant battle. And we also have the affordability crisis here in Florida. So that doesn't help matters either. So, I mean, if teachers are ranked at the bottom here and we can't afford to live here, then you're going to definitely see those teachers leave the state. And that's why we're seeing Andrew Spar pointed out that over the last 5 years, I think there's only 1 year his daughter has had all of her teachers the entire school year. So I think there was 10 weeks she started without an English teacher. Now she's without an anatomy teacher right now. And so it's different subject areas. So we're seeing the examples like this happening across the state.
Education funding is such an enormous part of the budget. Cody, any sense that the House and Senate are close at least on agreeing on how to fund education?
Their initial agreements I believe were close. And so I imagine that might be one of the areas that they've already kind of hashed out. When they start the budget process next week, they're going to pass the same budget that they did during the regular session to set them up for conference committees. They've already sorted out kind of where they're going to make some of those cuts. And so we'll see that play out. They should hopefully come to an agreement, hopefully by the end of next week. If not, for the most of the budget. Otherwise, it'll be bumped up between Senator Albritton and Speaker Perez on kind of sorting out any outlying differences after that. So hopefully we'll see an agreement early on that front, but you can't predict anything with this legislature right now. All right, that's all the time we have for this week's edition of Florida Politics Now. We'll see you again next week.